Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
Well, greetings. As Claire is very kindly kind of giving everyone a special tag, given that Liz started. It's lovely to talk to you all. Thank you. Greetings from sunny Boston at just gone 11 in the morning. We put the clocks go forward here a couple of weeks ago. So at the moment we're 4 hours apart, but I feel that we're all together in this lovely room now, sort of talking about sustainability with this cohort of alumni. So it's good to talk to you. I think this was a request on the back of the Cambridge lab in January that we spent, I think, about 20 minutes or so doing something that I know that myself and Ian had spent a week exploring as a model. So we thought, well, maybe we should spend a bit more time going through it. So I'll just give a little bit of context, and then we'll start to dissect the model a little bit. And I think you've got some of that background. So the first thing is just to kind of remind us that my slides need to go forward. Why are they not going forward? Oh yeah, that it's that kind of mantra of mine of standing together and breathing and reminding ourselves really that what we do as universities really does matter. And I think that's never more important than in these kind of chaotic times. We talked about VUCA, didn't we, about volatility and uncertainty and complexity and ambiguity, and every now and then we just need to kind of go, where are we heading again? What's this about? Rather than just trying to meet every challenge. And I listen to the radio from the UK all the time, and it's from a distance it just feels awful. It feels horrible at the moment with the Brexit stuff, and this having to deal with uncertainty, and how do you plan when everything is so ambiguous and we're a couple of days away, etc. So there is a sort of sense that hold on to that mission and vision and values really of what universities are about. So we very much took the sustainability isn't about future generations, about tomorrowville. It's very much that how do we integrate sustainability and sustainable development thinking into the work that we do every day. And so how do we kind of put on our sustainability goggles and kind of look through those, our teaching, our learning, our research, our innovation, our campus services, our student services, our work with the community, our internationalization efforts, very local, maybe hyper local activities in our place, but also connecting those to a sort of broader direction of humanity, really. And I think that's a real sense of making it personal, making it part of the day job, and getting it on the agenda for today, as opposed to something that's out there. I think we had this slide, and I just love this slide. It comes from Jack Spengler here, and just kind of, you don't need to say any more other than, the future that people are predicting is already here. We're already seeing environmental refugees. We're already seeing, a real sense of massive migrations within, I know even within the States, parts of Florida moving further inland and so on. So there's some really big things going on. I think we know all of that. So that's our kind of contextual kind of background. And we touched on a little bit the kind of global megatrends that underlie all of that. So we touched on whether it's climate change, as I've just mentioned, or whether there's these huge demographics, whether it's the sense of an aging population, fewer 18-year-olds, longer living in many countries, so that you've got people working longer, wanting to reinvent and transition. And so the idea of finishing your formal education by the time you're 21, 22 is going to seem ridiculous in a few years' time. And then we went on to some of the things around generational impacts, the Generation Z coming in, or Zs now coming in to universities, our hunt for a curation of all the different choices, and so how can we curate choices to help simplicity, and this sense that we've lost trust in whether it's the Catholic Church, whether it's politicians, whether it's institutional leaders, and you see the kinds of things that are going on, I think, in a number of higher education and further education colleges around failures of governance. So there's some real big societal trends, and I think where we tried to position was let's take some some kind of guidance, really, from the sense that world leaders sat together and sought to come up with an ambitious a global strategy, which was connected to local actions. And so if we take ownership of the things that we're able to control and engage with, the sum of that collective endeavour on behalf of humanity drives us towards this future where no one's left behind. So we've got a sense that in the kind of chaotic VUCA environment, that we can kind of use and share the Sustainable Development Goals as a kind of shared narrative that help us to make sense of tying together these different strands of work and reminding us of that bigger picture. And the reason that we're talking about leadership is, I think, the sense that sustainability, as we look at it as whether it's about resilience or agility or sustainable development, and however you describe that, but it is very much about, it needs to be led, it needs to have, and that is starting with self-leadership as well as what we might consider to be more formal organisational leadership. And we touch very briefly on some of the characteristics that start to really define this new leadership sort of characteristics when we're looking at organisations, universities, colleges as the firm, and a very kind of the Henry Ford model, really, of leadership and telling. And we're moving into a very different kind of 21st century leadership, which is about building trust, being present, having relationships with other people, and being interested and collaborative and curious. And I'm just doing some work now which is around, the defining kind of characteristics, really, which are about being curious and about others, recognizing what you don't know, but also having, alongside that humility that means that you can learn from others and genuinely, be present with them and start to build the capital that allows things to get done, which is about trust and it's about relationships. And so there's a lot more characteristics that start to find themselves on that list. A lot of those kind of go back to kind of emotional intelligence and so on, but I think there's some new things emerging as being more important. And one of the things that's really striking, I think, is that leaders, say back in the 20th century, were very much focused on, in many ways, managing the firm, managing inside the organization, talking about structures and functions, and they were internally focused and trying to de-risk and control inside their organizations. And I think now we're seeing that leaders, in terms of their activities, are very much externally facing, in a sense that it's the external things that are impacting on their organizations, on their reputation, whether it's about supply chains, sustainable investment, what they're doing with their pension funds, what's happening locally with their food chains, etc., etc. So there's a sense that lifting your eyes outwards and having to work with others is kind of where we're getting to. And we touched on this, that it's all about the people and how often we listen to leadership and change projects and all the kinds of management speak, if you like, that's come into the university sector, and just forget to talk about people, individuals changing their behaviours, inspired by colleagues, wanting to, that fear of missing out, FOMO as they call it, that peer pressure, wanting to create community, really, and the sense that we talk about organisational change, in the sense as if it's this kind of amorphous, inanimate object, and actually we recognise, as we said, that organisations don't change, people change. And so we need to recognise how is it that we work to inspire, to engage, to create the conditions that allow people to express themselves around their passions and interests, but guide those towards a kind of shared purpose, a shared direction. And I think we touched on the fact that culture, so if we unpack that, it's how people speak to one another, the kinds of things that get rewarded, how they're thinking, how they're framing decisions, that really can destroy either a well-formulated or a badly formulated strategy, but the sense that we don't spend enough time of socialising some of the change. And I think that's what we're going to touch on now as we look at the model. Now, you saw this before as well around the organisation. It's just thinking about this organisation. It has a postcode. It typically has a building. It has, access points. You may even have an ID badge. You've got this sense that it's a bounded, physical, in many ways, physical thing, which has some level of organisation. It has departments or service teams or units, or it's very much anchored. And there are lots of good things about that. We talk about the anchor institution and so on. But as we start to try and get our organisations to be much more orientated and agile and future facing, we're finding that this future that's unraveling, it's coming to us in little kind of little bites, little snapshots, little whispers about how people are behaving. It's not organised, it's not defined, it's not anchored in any way. And so we've immediately got this tension between this kind of organisation which has these boundaries, and then this amorphous, unraveling, unbounded future, and we're finding that they're butting up against each other. So how does this amorphous future start to wind its way through all our clunky, defined systems, processes, business planning, all the kind of architecture that we've set up, when times were more certain, when the kind of uncertainty, the kind of pace and scale and the number of different axes of change that are happening all at one time, how are we trying to manage that? We're trying to force it into this machine, which is very well bounded, which often has, processes and policies and regulations and ways of behaving and ways of rewarding people for behaving in a time that was defined by more certainty. And so that's why I think we're getting into, look, why is stuff not happening? Why do I feel overloaded? Why can't I get, the things that I'm seeing? I think particularly in the sustainability lens, you're very much kind of understanding the reliance on external environments, natural resources, people resources, those more intangible assets that we're having to manage, and recognizing that we're running out of road. I mean, we talked about needing 3 planets or 5 planets depending on whether you live like someone in the UK or someone in the US. So there was a sense that something's got to change, and we touched on this very short little note about things are speeding up, and maybe there's something about the corporation, this kind of institutional functionality represented through universities, and many universities losing, I think, some of the more community of scholars approach, and trying to become more like businesses, business-like. You hear that narrative coming up in the sector a lot. And how can we get more tuned in, really, to picking up noise, picking up the future, picking up those trends, and being more responsive in a way that doesn't overwhelm these kind of the architecture of how change is progressed within an institution. So that's where we landed on sustainability. Sustainability being this real key driver of innovation. So new ideas, new ways of learning, how we maybe don't launch massive transformational projects, but maybe we start to think about experiments and learning, and being a learning organisation that's piloting different ways of thinking, different ways of doing. Maybe we recognise the fundamental differences among academic departments and institutions, and don't try to have everybody running at the same speed and pretend everything's the same. There's a lot of things that we can unpack in that. But I think what comes back to it is the way that we seek to lead, to show the way, to guide people, to enable people, is changing fundamentally. And this kind of telling style doesn't really work, particularly in institutions. And we looked at this graph, really, which is that as we start to affect some of these changes, there is a kind of silent phase when we're being asked to do the day job and we're being asked to actually do the change and change the day job. So stuff still has to happen, and we're overlaying onto that, onto some very busy teams and people who are stretched in many different ways, not only in an organisational or a work context, but also managing this ambiguity and this complexity in their personal, private, family lives, in their community lives as well. So there's a real sense of, at work, at least there they know what they're doing, they know. And actually now we're saying, well, actually it's a bit difficult here too. So there is a sort of sense that when we start to affect change, there's this kind of silent period where people are working on day job and change. And it feels that they're using up a lot of resource. And sometimes that resource is a physical resource in terms of money, for example, but often what we're asked to do is to use up a resource, goodwill. We're asked to uplift some more discretionary effort into our organisations before we even get to any additional staff or more space or more resources. And then we might begin, if an innovation starts to take off, we might get into resource allocation or additionality, additional resources coming in as we start to move it forward and scale it. But it's how do we manage that beginning part in a way that's very open and saying, look, we're asking more of you, or we create a kind of revolving fund, or whether it's of people, of volunteers, or whether it's a genuine revolving fund of sorry. A genuine revolving fund where there is actual resource like cash that you can buy things or buy in some additional people and support, or maybe it's student energy through projects that allows that silent phase to really take off and actually recognise that you are eating up resources, and therefore you cannot expect an institution or a team or a department or a unit or a group to start affecting change on the basis of what their current resource allocation is. That somehow you are going to be a consuming resource in that silent phase of change. So the model that we touched on was the Seabees model that Leith Sharp here, when she was, Leith Sharp was the director for the Office for Sustainability at Harvard for many years. I think she's been out of that role for as many years now. But when she finished that role, she took some time to kind of think, how did I get done the sorts of things, how did I deliver the change that we delivered, such that people were talking about Harvard's crimson, green being the new crimson, so crimson is Harvard's colour. So how did she affect that kind of institution-wide transformation around sustainability? What were the lessons? And I think what's attractive about the model is that it's kind of come out of practice, and it's come out of genuine change leaders who are focused on sustainability, thinking, how do we get this stuff to happen? And then we've subsequently, through myself and Teresa, we've subsequently overlaid that now with some academic framework to kind of build the robustness of that. And so it really relies on a kind of a truth that we often don't admit to one another. We talk about and I've done it myself many times, that we talk about, we started over here and then we landed over here, or we have plans that are, actually will be often linear in their diagrams or in their approach to milestones, deliverables, month 3, Q4, and those kinds of, the words that we're using to describe our plans are often linear. And when we tell the story back about how we delivered a change, again, that story starts at one point and finishes at another. It's often linear. This happened, then we did that, then we did that. And actually, we're missing out much of the truth of that actual story, which is about the ups and the downs, the frustrations, the sheer grit that it takes to get things across the line, the personal resilience, the institutional kind of barriers, the institutional enablers, where you found a conversation accelerated the change you wanted to see, where you found a particular decision step, actually you came away from that feeling really frustrated that they just didn't get it. Why don't they get it? Why can't they see? And so that actuality of the experience, that up and down kind of journey of how a new idea starts to take form and starts to become an innovation and then get delivered and finally absorbed into just the way we do stuff around here. That journey inside that pattern is some real data. And I think that's the kind of message really as you start to look at this, is inside that experience there is some rich data. Can you pull out that data of what helped, what hindered, and start to map and plan your change projects in a way that draws on that rich data so that you make that learning conscious and you use it to plan forward so that you're effectively getting accelerating it through and using that experience as a kind of currency to drive change as you go forward. And I think we've all seen these kind of things of, you know, wow, this is a fabulous idea, let's get everyone around it, let's set up a project team, then it crashes, someone leaves, you know, you think that you're going to put it into your strategic plan, you don't get the resources, we want to do it anyway, can I find other ways, can I put it into the student domain and get some project work, can I get, you know, a bit of funding out of a revolving green fund, can I maybe get a donor, or can I tuck it into my PhD project? And you see it kind of moving up and down as an idea which is a human kind of piece of creativity, is drawn out, is shared, is given form, and then starts to turn into an innovation. It's still new, and then eventually it just becomes absorbed into the organisation, and it becomes the way you do things in that organisation, in that team. And so the concept then that emerged from that is, can we actually do a piece of mapping about where did this idea come from? How was it expressed? Who was around? Where did it go next? How did it start to get maybe some resource? Where did it go for formal approval? What happened at that approval? When did it get to the board? When did it get to the senior management? At what point was it socialised and practiced? What did we learn from some of those pilots? And actually mapping in kind of real time a project. So the kind of exercise is to sit down either on your own or with a small team and say, let's take one of the projects that we either delivered or let's take one of the projects that we thought we were going to deliver and that got derailed, and can we actually stand by a chart or a whiteboard or whatever and actually map out the individual stages of how and what happened. And so over the years through the programs, we've been gathering up lots of different idea flow maps, and with a level of detail that is forensic, you know, that makes sense to the individuals who are drawing them. And I think the reason that we're interested about how ideas emerge and how they take form and how they then become an innovation and then how they become absorbed into the way you do things around here is because ideas really are the currency by which, you know, an organisation moves forward. It is the differentiation, it is the distinctiveness, it is the currency of how things move forward. And I'm really struck, as I talk to more and more and more leaders, of just how careless we are with that human creativity, about, you know, how much courage it takes to release your idea into an organisation. You know, you're risking status, you're taking a risk, a personal risk. And so how many of our organisations now maybe don't feel safe enough for you to say, well, have we thought about doing it like this? Or I saw so-and-so when I went to this conference, or I learned about this from my reading, I saw this on the internet, I was talking to students, and some of that, you know, that rich feedback. Never ever in history have we had such a rich feedback mechanisms from all sorts of dimensions, and yet we're kind of taking that feedback and coming up with ideas, and maybe we're fearful about sharing those. Or even if we take this big risk of sharing an idea, then it just gets crushed by a colleague, by an individual manager, by someone who's frightened about thinking that if that idea took hold and took hook, maybe I won't feel like the expert in the room. Maybe they won't need 4 of these members of staff, and I'll lose kudos. Maybe I'll lose, you know. So there's a real sense that this machine, this organisational architecture, starts to be attacking of human creativity and ideas. And yet it's one of those things that, if as a leader you can create the culture, the sense of psychological safety, that if you can get people to tell you what they think is going wrong, what they think is going right, ideas they've seen at other places, and draw on that intelligence through each of those individual members of your team, because they're connected to different communities inside and outside your organisation, and bring those ideas in. So recognising that your role as a leader has a significant influence on how those ideas flow out into your organisation. So then it was just, at a very reductionist way, it's taking an organisation saying, look, it's basically a formal hierarchy, and we're pretty used to understanding that kind of formal hierarchy. I report to him and look up to him, and I look down to him, that old kind of Ronnie Barker sketch. And then there's a whole suite of communities that I can opt in and opt out of, which are much more amorphous, much more drawn around this shared purpose. They're much more forming and reforming and standing down. So they're kind of task and finish groups, they're project groups, they might be special interest groups, they could be a university choir, they could be a standing teaching and learning committee, they could be a clean-up campaign of a local beach, they could be a very formal research committee. So those kind of social networks that we're all involved with, whether it's a formal one in those kind of groups and committees and project groups I described, or very much something you're just sitting down and having a cup of coffee with someone and saying, oh my God, have you just seen the latest that so-and-so has just put out? Or, wow, I was just at the University of so-and-so and I saw this. It'd be really good if we could maybe pilot. I've just come back from the EAUC conference and heard all these wonderful things that other institutions are doing, and I'd like to talk about those. So there's lots of that sense of that social networks which tend to align around purpose, and then this kind of formal route of the hierarchy. And both of those being kind of necessary, but importance of the interactions between them and the balance between them. And that's really what the model talked about. And I think, you know, we can, you know, I don't think there's anything kind of magic about the model in any way. It's just kind of, yeah, I see that, I can understand that, I can see where my organisation fits with what's being said. But I think what is different is the way that you are conscious about the way that people are interacting through the formal architecture, through the informal social spaces, and how you as a leader start to navigate, manipulate is probably the wrong word, but how you are able to traverse those communities in a very conscious way, in a planned way, as you move an idea through from it being expressed into it being tested and piloted, to this innovation, to it being taken up formally by the organisation, by the team, by the department, whatever level you're working at. And so it's the recognition of this kind of command control, the kind of roles and responsibilities that the hierarchy has, the kind of roles and responsibilities that this community of different networks has. And there's been some really interesting governance changes as people have worked with this model. There was one university president that went back and said, we've got a teaching and learning committee where the people who are on it because they are associate dean teaching and learning, or associate vice president, or whatever they call them, and they're there by role, i.e. they're there drawn around into this community of teaching and learning committee because they are a member of the hierarchy. And he disbanded all of that, kept the teaching and learning committee, and turned it into a much more unbounded community structure, which said, show up if what excites your passion, if we're your best self, is that you show up if you're interested in teaching and learning. And he said that over a period of about 18 months, the vibrancy and the activity of that community changed massively from this fairly moribund showing up because you were wearing a particular t-shirt with a particular role title on it. And I was, reflecting on my own experiences in university settings and thinking, wow, how interesting about those turn up and gather round, and where people are really excited about something, versus some of the moribund committees that we have. Some of them are necessary, but maybe they're not the best place to have some of the discursive functions and the creativity and the idea creation that we're looking for. And maybe we need to be much smarter about how we design our governance and our hierarchy and our sort of social networks to get the best out of our organisations in terms of the people. And so there was a sense that we looked at this to say, okay, I see the actual hierarchy. I recognise that, but I also can start to map out this kind of shadow hierarchy. I know it says that Carol is in charge of so and so, but don't go and talk to her until you've spoken to Emily, and make sure that once you've spoken to Emily, make sure that Clive doesn't. That he gets briefed about it, doesn't need to know about it, but he doesn't like surprises. So all that kind of intelligence that you have about who and where to take things, is you start to use that in a very conscious way when you're planning things, as opposed to maybe the first couple of times you've done these things is muddling through and finding closed doors and open doors. Is that you map that out, you make it visible, and you share it with people around you so that you all get smarter and at making change happen. And so it was this sense that there's nothing intrinsically bad about the management hierarchy. There's nothing intrinsically bad or good about the social networks. It's this idea of how do they come together and do the things that they're best placed for, and how many times have we got hierarchies when we need social networks, and how many times have we got social networks when we need a bit more hierarchy. And so it's like, how can we align those things and design that into our governance processes at any level? It could be wherever you are in the organisation. And so just to show you a couple of idea flow maps and encourage you maybe to do some of this as an activity with your own teams or just on your own, is just to sort of think about, okay, hierarchy is able to say, once we've got something, we think it's going to work, we're going to hardwire it into the way we do things around here. The social networks are great at coming up with new ideas, testing them, piloting them, socializing them, finding out how they might work. It's a real innovation sort of ecosystem, if you like, a real innovation space. So looking at some of these idea flow maps, so it's basically drawing out along the bottom the time. And I think when we look at some of the actual maps, it's worth saying that most of the timelines are in years, not days or weeks. So it's recognizing that change takes a long time in many cases. And then up the side, it's just saying, however you're defining success, you've got a yes, might be your definition of success when you're asking for a resource. You've got a no, might be that's a measure of anti-success in a sense. It was a no, so you would score it down, and you start to draw out your map and actually write on it what phases, what steps, who was there, and get as much detail as you can. So I'll show you a couple. So this is the kind of way that people were drawing out their maps, and they were sort of saying, well, someone came up with the idea, and then it was piloted, and then it was sort of took off, and then there was a sort of sense that it died off in that sort of top corner there, and it was because somebody left. And I think we often see this. It's like somebody leaves and then everyone's like, well, is that still happening? Because they were the champion, because they didn't build out those alliances and those allegiances that made it start to become part of the fabric, so there was someone else who could start to champion and push it along. There are other examples where you can see an idea has emerged and it's taken its time and got resources, and it's started to build coalitions, and then it's really taken off, and then they've stopped and said, oh, how is this working? I'm in a piloting phase. What do I learn about this? Okay, let's add some more resource, let's scale up, let's socialize this, let's get it really into the next iteration. And then you can suddenly see yeah, it's just, well, you know, that's how they do it there. That's what they do at that institution. And it just has gone into the fabric of being hardwired into the function and the systems and the processes that institution uses. Others sometimes take off and then they die off because maybe they're an idea ahead of its time, or maybe there's the context of how that change was happening, or maybe there's a funding change, and then later on the same idea with all its kind of intelligence about what worked and what didn't takes off again, but maybe at a lower level. Maybe something that was a pan-institutional project people just don't embrace fully, but actually one or more of the academic schools or departments or services does take it on and starts to use it in there, but it maybe didn't go across. And there are some others where you get kind of sign off and real energy, and you get, you know, vice chancellors putting out policy statements and they're making public announcements about all these wonderful things they're going to do, and then actually, because they haven't built any alliances or allegiances, or they haven't socialized the idea, or they haven't spoken to anybody, it just dies out. And you see, often you see that in politics a lot, where there's this kind of rush to make announcements. I remember when I was at Biz, I used to get all the ministers fighting over who was going to announce what, where, and what constituency, particularly in the coalition government as it was then. You know, so you get the announcement and a lot of activity around the announcement, but then you get no follow-up or no resources allocated to it, so there's no way it was going to happen. And one that Joanna Chamberlain shared with us, and we hoped at Cambridge that she'd be able to get along, but she was ill, as you remember, was one of the most elaborate idea flow maps I think that we've ever seen, and it's because of the complexity of the governance at Cambridge that it meant that that complexity of multiple hierarchies and multiple social networks is such an elaborate one. It's a great example. So she talked about her idea flow map, which was where somebody in the centre of Cambridge University, so at the central administration within the formal hierarchy, tasked her to engage in the development of a sustainability plan, an environmental sustainability plan. So tasked them in that group, and then this is the kind of flow that happened after that. So the other hierarchies across the colleges were alerted. Other groups started talking and setting up their own groups to make contributions, and you start to see this complexity. So I'm just going to go back through that little animation because it's just, I think, so elaborate. So a simple task allocation, and this is the kind of institutional kind of noise and activity that is being created, which made it happen. They did get it signed off. It took 3 years. But it just shows you that sort of pebble in the pond of an activity, if you like, and then the kind of ripples that go out across the hierarchies and the social networks within one institution, albeit a very elaborate institution which is highly devolved around the college structure. So the kinds of things that happen when ideas emerge, if they emerge at all, you know, having that, as I say, that psychological safety, as it gets sidelined, it's like, there, dear, that's very nice. Or it goes into a decision-making process that just doesn't get it, because often our decision-making processes are still focused on the return on investment, the ROI, where we know a lot about the investment that we need, but often we still are insufficiently sophisticated about what is the return that we're looking for, because that return might just be happier people, and we don't have a metric for that. We don't have a KEF or a TEF or a REF or whatever for that. So it kind of, that somehow the decisions, the value creation of that new idea is still being insufficiently expressed within the metrics, the basket of metrics that we currently have to judge what is a good idea versus what is not going to get progressed versus what might get progressed. That you're still asking for new resource, and we're still in this kind of scarcity framework of resource being scarce. Or finally, you get to the point where it actually gets signed off, and it's such an exhausting process, and it's so bloodied, and you've taken so many personal risks, and had so much hassle and grief that you think, but at least it got approved and something's happened. So you start to see as an organisation moves forward, most of our organisations look like this, that there are formal hierarchies with sort of groups of advisors, whether formal or informal, and there's a maturity to that process. And as a leader, you can move into a task and finish group, and you can still come out of it and judge the outcomes. I've always been really impressed by the way that unions work in that way, that they're able to contribute to the dialogue with management, but then step out and across the line and put their formal union hat on when they're asked to approve or not a policy. And so there's a very sophisticated way of being able to both engage in a community endeavour as well as step across the line and then make a judgment. I think it's harder as you go up the sort of hierarchy. I must say, I think it was very difficult to take off your vice chancellor hat, walk into a room and take it off and try and, you know, roll your sleeves up and start talking, because people just felt she likes this, she doesn't like that, and you know, it started to get difficult to take your hat off. So the kinds of things that we see that interfere, and there are lots and lots of examples, but I'll just give you two big ones. The kind of things that interfere with this flow of ideas through to innovation and therefore change is when you've got a hierarchy and the rest of the organisation that are just not talking, or they're just not tuned in to the feedback, the data, the information, the kinds of intelligence that all of their individual staff members, students are gathering for them is just being ignored, and they're really very much out of touch. And you see this in a lot of universities and colleges where the kind of centre, the university centre, does not have a clue about what is going on in their institutions. So there's a real separation, you know, at an extreme level. It might not be as extreme as that, but actually there are massive gaps. Or you see a lot of really good community activity and lots of people coming together and coming up with great ideas and different ways of doing stuff, and there's a real vibrancy in the organisation, but actually there's still a lack of connectivity to get those things into hardwiring into how things happen in the organisation. So the point of doing a kind of retrospective flow diagram is that you do start to draw out of those patterns information that allows you to design forward how you're going to push through a change process, how you're going to plan a change process. So it's turning that information in that pattern into a plan of action for when you next come up against it, and keeping that going as you get more and more and more sophisticated at doing these things and actually build up your repertoire of skills and tools and techniques and so on. So this was, I think, a slide that tried to capture everything, which is saying how an idea emerges, you know, creating that culture of permission, expectation. Maybe it's not permission, maybe it's requiring people to come up with ideas and never being really satisfied and always being in this continuous improvement kind of mindset, and how those ideas then get iterated through the organisation until they finally get piloted, rolled out, and as I say, they're just the way you do things around here. And it's what does the hierarchy do really well, and what does the kind of community of social networks do really well. So they're trying to test an idea, see if it will work, come up with the issues, what else needs to change. They're looking at interdependencies, where there are connections, what other things need to go on. And the senior management is really looking at how can we integrate this into everything else that we're doing? Does something else have to stop doing? Do we have to close a particular computer lab or a program to make this happen? Do we have to allocate resource from one area to another? It's doing that hardwiring piece. And so it's trying to look at the whole flow of an idea, and you can overlay that with the sorts of groups, committees and ways in your own organisation. So we touched on this very briefly, and I'll leave it with you, but there was a sense that stop talking about granting permission and start talking about we are a learning organisation. We are by definition an education organisation. So let's actually embrace the idea that we also learn. We learn from how we do things, and therefore require and mandate that this is where ideas come to live, come to get tested. Some fail, some progress, some fail but come up later because they're timely. And don't talk about launching big projects, but talk about experiments and learning and piloting, and come up with this idea that we're really looking to see if this fits and how it might fit and what's wrong with it and what's right with it and how we can move it forward, and start to celebrate where you get wins and creativity, and celebrate that, talk about ideas, and in a very positive way, that this is something that we need to steward and curate and celebrate that human creativity, and make sure that we communicate it. And then the other thing is that to try and stop, I don't think we'll ever stop politicians launching things, but to stop managers feeling that they need to launch things all the time, and just commit to a direction of travel over the long term. And I think this is where sustainability sits, is this: there is a direction, there is a sense of mission and vision, a commitment over the long term, and not a sort of flim-flam kind of, oh, we better react to something, and this kind of reacting to every little bit of scuffle and difference that's happening in our environment. So the focus then is, how do we get all the stuff that we've maybe learned, how do we make that conscious, that unconscious competence, how do we turn it into a conscious way of behaving and share it with teams, so they don't have to get the kind of scars on their back that maybe you have, and you get smarter and better and more conscious that you are affecting and delivering a change within an organisation which is bounded with people who are wonderfully complex and wonderfully abundant in their creativity. But it's like, how can you manage that and corral people around that shared purpose? So one thing that captured this brilliantly for me was the RSA's kind of mission, which says, think a system. So you're thinking about how your organisation works, what their priorities are in their strategic plan. It might be internationalisation, it might be local, it might be being a community, it might be research intensivity. But how do you get the stuff that you want to do as part of that agenda? So thinking at a system level, but then acting in a very entrepreneurial way. And I think that's, for me, a really interesting way to start to think about sustainability leadership, is having to take that systems approach, not only within your organisation, but you're thinking globally about how it connects to communities, and then how you need to be entrepreneurial in terms of moving things along and knowing that doing the same old is just not sustainable in many cases. So that's really a little bit of an expansion of the, I think, 20 minutes or so that we had at the Cambridge lab to talk about the model. I'm very happy to take any comments or questions, or we can follow up through Claire. So I'll stop speaking now and listen. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? More than welcome to open up your microphones or use the chat box if you want to ask Wendy anything just on that.
Hi guys, Pat here from the UCC. Just want to say, Wendy, what kind of resonates actually what's happening on the ground here, around relationships and leadership, and not using the traditional organizational structures to get sustainability there, using them where it's advantageous, but really building relationships within the people that are the influencers within the colleges or the schools. So even when I was at that leadership program, and again today, it just kind of says, yeah, I'm actually doing that, but we're doing that more by accident as opposed to following kind of set protocols or set kind of strategy,
I'd like to ask you a question. Did you go back and give your Pro Vice Chancellor, Vice President a hug?
I did actually, because well done on your memory. I thought that we didn't go too well. But I told them at WMTO.
Yeah, and your case, I was going to say your case comes up next Thursday, in front of the magistrate or whatever. But you're absolutely right, and I think that's why I think it's really interesting that this model emerged from from not a theoretical birth. It emerged very much from a practical, trying to get stuff done birth, and that's really interesting that you use the term, things happen by accident. And you're absolutely right. That's kind of what Leith's experience was of, how can I get faster and smarter at the stuff that I'm in a discovery mode. I'm kind of thrashing through this unknown territory. Actually, I've walked bits of this journey before. Can I have a little map? And so it's almost, can I design, I want to get from here to here. And at the moment, we're quite easy. We can put stuff into Google Maps and go, okay, that's the different options are going from A to B and A via C and around. But can I actually design my own change map within my organizational context? And that's what's interesting about the academic side of the model. It's quite generic, and therefore you have to personalize and tailor it into your own organizational setting, because that every organization is different. I don't think we can say this is how change management should take place. It's like, here's an architecture that makes you ask yourself questions, and then makes you say, can I map out my information that I've gathered through these experiments and accidents, and make that very visible, make it conscious, and use it again and again, and get smarter and smarter as I do these things, and share it and build that capacity within your colleagues as well. So I think using the word accident is a great term.
Anyone else got any comments or questions for Wendy? There's lots to take in. No? Okay. Just to give everyone who's on the call, and I will send out an email, just a quick update on kind of where we are in terms of keeping this wonderful group of people just really connected and kind of keeping the learning sessions going. We are going to be looking at planning ahead, something which we are calling currently the Leadership Academy. And that's once everybody's kind of finished this cohort, we'll keep moving it on. But what we would love to do is connect up with previous delegates who've attended the residential leadership lab and tap into kind of all that experience and all that knowledge, and just start that discussion group going and let everybody an opportunity to kind of partner up. So what we're thinking of doing, and what we hope we'll look at doing going forward, and we will partly just to test what you think, and partly also what people who have attended the sessions before have thought, that we will keep running these webinars where we have a focus and a topic, so kind of a training, learning kind of webinar, and those will be things that we'll get from you. So hopefully you can send us things that you hope to cover, things that you think would be of interest. Possibly things that you think that you could present on, or that your institution is very good at, that would help the rest of the Leadership Academy. And we hope to kind of run of those, we're hoping to do about 4 a year going forward, so kind of on a regular interval. And then possibly also offer just opportunities to get together. So the last call we did was really just a chance to chat about things, talk about experiences we've had, and just have a bit of a catch up. With any luck, we'll be able to do some of those at the conference when we hopefully all together, but also some of them will be virtual. So again, just an opportunity to have a chat, maybe bounce some ideas off each other, get some input into difficulties or anything that we're experiencing or research that we're doing, and share that. The other thing we're also thinking of doing is either coaching or supervision, or possibly we could call it buddies, mentoring, something like that. So we're going to put together a little questionnaire, which we like, and hopefully send that out to you and cohorts that have previously been with us, so that we can just test the waters to see if that's what people want. Because obviously there's no point in doing it if it's not something that you all think would be useful and beneficial. So feedback on that and topics for webinars going forward, gratefully received. And let's just kind of keep talking, let's keep the conversation going, and let's keep engaging with each other. Wendy, anything else from you?
No, just I think missing the the kind of conversation. I think it'd be really lovely to have opportunities where people aren't kind of doing broadcasting information in the way that I've just been doing, but actually we're having a conversation about a particular topic. Would be great. I'm really intrigued about how, you know, leadership is more outward facing and managing things beyond the bounded organization. And there's probably, you know, some topics that people have got that they would like to have a conversation with a few folk around and then turn up because they're interested in that. So I'd really like to do that. But I really, I mean, I know we've spoken about this with Ian and so on, is trying to come up with a construct where we recognise the alumni of the last of the Cambridge programmes, and recognising that community of practice is so powerful. It's such an incredible resource, and so looking for ways to sustain that group and actually to learn from one another within that group, I think is just really, really exciting. So I'm really excited about that. Yeah, so just thank people for turning up today, and so it's good. Thank you, Claire.
Great, thank you, Wendy.
You're welcome.
We will send out a couple of emails. Obviously, we are looking at setting up a Jiskmail now, which will just be for alumni. We've tried a few other bits and bobs to try and link up, but not everyone has access to everything. So what we think is we'll stick with the Jiskmail because it is quite a good way of people communicating with each other.
Great.
Okay.
Cheerio. Well, enjoy your rest of your days, everyone, and keep rocking on the old sustainability leadership. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Wendy. Really appreciate your time.
You're welcome.
All right.
Cheers. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye-bye.